In the spring of 1996, several commercial expeditions converged on Everest's southeast ridge, moving through fixed ropes and high camps as a narrow weather window opened over the South Col. What began as a coordinated summit push gradually fractured into scattered descent routes as conditions shifted, radio contact weakened, and climbers became dispersed across altitudes where survival margins are measured in hours, not days. What unfolded next was not a single rescue, but a chain of decisions made in thinning air, where exhausted guides and climbers re-entered the death zone in attempts to retrieve those still trapped above. You will follow how those rescue efforts formed, where they failed, and why the same mountain that took lives during the storm also claimed the people who tried to bring others back. The story moves through Camp 4, the South Col, and the Upper Ridge, where evidence, testimony, and unanswered gaps still do not align. The balcony above the storm. Long before sunrise reached the upper ridges of Mount Everest on May 10th, 1996, thin lines of headlamps were already moving slowly through the darkness above Camp 4, scattered across the southeast ridge like drifting embers suspended over a black void. At more than 26,000 feet, inside the region climbers call the death zone, every movement required deliberate effort, and even the sound of breathing through an oxygen mask could become strangely mechanical after enough hours in the cold. The summit push had begun the previous night beneath unusually calm skies, yet something uneasy lingered over the mountain from the start, not as a dramatic warning, but as a gradual accumulation of small delays, crowded routes, and exhausted decisions that seemed manageable in isolation. Far below the ridge, the lights of lower camps disappeared beneath layers of cloud, while climbers continued upward toward terrain where weather forecasts, timing, and human judgment carried consequences that could not easily be reversed. The climbing season that spring had already drawn an unusually large number of commercial expeditions to Everest, reflecting how dramatically Himalayan mountaineering had changed by the mid-1990s. Guided summit attempts, once considered rare and controversial, had become increasingly common after companies began offering clients with limited high-altitude experience the opportunity to stand on the highest point on Earth under the supervision of professional guides and Sherpas. Among the most visible teams on the mountain were adventure consultants, led by New Zealand guide Rob Hall, and Mountain Madness, led by American climber Scott Fisher. Both men were respected throughout the mountaineering world, not only because they had successfully guided Everest expeditions before, but because each had developed a reputation for remaining calm in dangerous conditions. Hall, known for his methodical approach and careful logistics, had already guided dozens of climbers to major Himalayan summits. Fisher carried a different presence, more physically aggressive and charismatic, often pushing himself through exhaustion, with an intensity that impressed even experienced climbers. Their clients arrived on Everest carrying different motivations, though many shared the same quiet belief that reaching the summit represented more than physical achievement. Some hoped to recover from personal loss. Others pursued lifelong ambitions shaped by books and documentaries that portrayed Everest as the ultimate test of endurance. Among them was Doug Hansen, a postal worker from Washington state attempting the mountain again, after turning back the previous year near the summit. There was also Yasuko Namba from Japan, who had already climbed 6 of the 7 summits and hoped Everest would complete the list. Beck Weathers, a Texas pathologist, joined the expedition partly to escape depression that had followed him for years. Journalist John Krakauer climbed with Hall's team while on assignment for Outside magazine, initially intending to write about the growing commercialization of Everest before finding himself trapped inside the story itself. By the evening of May 9th, climbers began preparing for the summit attempt from Camp 4 on the South Col, a barren plateau of ice and rock positioned nearly 8,000 meters above sea level. At that altitude, the human body deteriorates rapidly even at rest. Oxygen saturation drops low enough to impair memory, concentration, and judgment, while dehydration thickens the blood and exhaustion becomes cumulative. Climbers rested inside torn nylon tents battered by wind, melting snow over stoves that barely functioned in the cold, while Sherpas checked oxygen bottles and regulators one final time. Outside, temperatures plunged far below freezing as guides reviewed turnaround times designed to force climbers to descend before afternoon weather patterns developed. Most expeditions followed an unwritten rule on Everest that reaching the summit was optional, but descending remained mandatory. The first climbers left Camp 4 around 11 o'clock that night, stepping into darkness illuminated only by moonlight and headlamps reflecting off snow crystals. Progress up the ridge was immediately slower than expected. Several teams from different expeditions had chosen the same summit window after meteorologists predicted relatively stable conditions for May 10th, and the narrow route above the South Col quickly became congested. Climbers clipped themselves one by one onto fixed ropes that stretched across steep ice slopes, where a single misstep could send someone falling thousands of feet down the Kangshung face or toward the western Serb. The climb demanded precision even under ideal conditions, yet many climbers had already spent weeks at extreme altitude enduring failed acclimatization rotations, illness, and physical decline before the summit push even began. Hours later, another problem emerged near a feature known as the balcony, a small shelf at approximately 27,500 feet, where climbers often stopped to change oxygen bottles before continuing upward. The fixed ropes that were supposed to be installed ahead of time along critical sections of the route had not yet been fully secured. Guides and Sherpas were forced to spend valuable time anchoring ropes, while clients waited in long lines on exposed slopes, standing nearly motionless in temperatures cold enough to freeze exposed skin within minutes. Every delay consumed oxygen reserves that had been carefully calculated days earlier. Climbers who remained still too long at that altitude also lost body heat rapidly, and fatigue deepened with dangerous speed. Despite the mounting delays, very few people turned around. Summit fever, a phrase frequently used in mountaineering after disasters, oversimplified what was happening high on the ridge that morning. Many climbers had invested years preparing for Everest and tens of thousands of dollars reaching the mountain. Some had sacrificed careers or family stability to be there. Others believed they were still operating within acceptable margins because the weather had not yet visibly deteriorated. Above all, the summit itself remained close enough to feel attainable. From certain points on the southeast ridge, climbers could already see the final pyramid of Everest rising ahead against the pale horizon, illuminated by the first traces of daylight spreading across Tibet. As dawn approached, wind speeds remained relatively calm, creating a deceptive sense of stability across the upper mountain. Climbers removed oxygen masks briefly to photograph the sunrise, or exchanged short words with teammates while frost formed around goggles and jacket collars. Yet conditions on Everest often changed with terrifying speed, particularly during the afternoon when jet stream patterns shifted across the summit. Some guides began noticing that the delays were pushing climbers dangerously behind schedule. Turnaround times, usually set around 1 or 2 in the afternoon regardless of summit status, already seemed increasingly difficult to enforce. Clients continued upward, guides continued managing traffic jams along the ropes, and scattered groups stretched farther apart across the mountain. Near the Hillary Step, another bottleneck formed as climbers waited their turn to cross the exposed rock face only a short distance below the summit. Radio communication between teams became inconsistent in the thin air, and small misunderstandings over oxygen supplies, climbing order, and timing slowly accumulated into larger problems that remained invisible to most people on the ridge. Several climbers later described a strange quiet settling over sections of the route despite the growing crowd, interrupted only by clipped breathing and the sound of metal carabiners scraping frozen rope. Above them, beyond the summit ridge and far out over the Tibetan plateau, a massive cloud had already begun moving toward the mountain. The blizzard that trapped the summit teams. Far beyond the summit ridge, the approaching cloud bank began swallowing sections of the mountain that had remained visible only minutes earlier. From high on Everest, storms did not always arrive as dramatic walls of darkness sweeping across the sky. Sometimes the first signs appeared almost deceptively minor, a change in wind direction over the ridge, distant cloud movement over Tibet, or the gradual disappearance of landmarks climbers had relied upon throughout the ascent. During the afternoon of May 10, 1996, many climbers descending from the summit were already dangerously behind schedule when conditions above the south summit began changing with unsettling speed. The upper slopes of Everest, which had appeared sharply defined beneath the morning sun only hours earlier, slowly dissolved into moving curtains of snow and cloud that erased the horizon from every direction. By the time the first climbers turned away from the summit, the descent already carried a different kind of silence than the climb upward. Reaching the top of Everest often created a brief emotional release after weeks of exhaustion and preparation. Yet that feeling rarely lasted long inside the death zone, where the human body continued deteriorating regardless of success. Several climbers had reached the summit well after the turnaround times established by their expedition leaders earlier that day. Some arrived as late as 2 or even 3 in the afternoon, leaving dangerously little margin for descent before darkness and worsening weather overtook the mountain. At more than 29,000 feet, even simple actions had become exhausting. Oxygen regulators iced over, gloves stiffened from frozen condensation. Climbers struggled to maintain concentration while descending terrain that demanded precision with every step. Nothing on the southeast ridge remained recognizable for long, once the wind began driving snow across the mountain from the Tibetan side. The route downward depended heavily on visual memory, because many sections of the ridge appeared nearly identical under snow and cloud. Fixed ropes anchored along the climbing line often served as the only reliable guide back toward the South Col, yet even those began disappearing beneath accumulating ice and blowing snow as visibility collapsed. Survivors later described conditions where they could barely see farther than a few feet ahead, their headlamps reflecting back into their own faces through the whiteout. Beneath the storm, Everest stopped resembling a mountain with clear routes and landmarks. It became a shifting landscape of darkness, wind, and exposed rock, where losing orientation for even a few minutes could become fatal. Near the Hillary Step, exhausted climbers stood motionless beside fixed ropes, while oxygen supplies dropped lower with every passing delay. Earlier bottlenecks on the route had already consumed valuable hours during the ascent, forcing climbers to wait in long lines at extreme altitude, while guides fixed ropes and managed traffic between multiple expeditions attempting the summit on the same day. Those delays now returned with deadly consequences during the descent. Many climbers had calculated their oxygen usage based on reaching Camp 4 long before nightfall, yet some remained trapped high above the south summit with nearly empty cylinders as the storm intensified around them. Several survivors later recalled noticing climbers staring blankly into the snow, unable to process instructions or move efficiently through sections of terrain they had climbed successfully only hours before. Radio calls reached Camp 4 in fragments, as guides attempted to determine who had descended safely and who remained stranded somewhere above the South Col. Inside the tents below, expedition leaders and Sherpas listened to transmissions distorted by static and wind while trying to piece together incomplete information about climbers scattered across the mountain. Some reports suggested climbers were descending normally. Others described people collapsing near the ridge or wandering away from the route in confusion. The altitude itself complicated communication, because hypoxia impaired memory, speech and judgment even among experienced mountaineers. Messages became contradictory. Names were repeated without confirmation. Climbers who'd been seen descending safely disappeared again into the storm minutes later. Among those still high on the mountain was adventure consultant's guide Rob Hall, who remained above the south summit with client Doug Hansen, after Hansen became too exhausted to continue descending. Hall had built his reputation around guiding clients safely to major summits, and throughout the expedition he had emphasized discipline, turnaround times, and caution. Yet Everest often punished hesitation and commitment with equal severity once conditions deteriorated beyond recovery. Hall continued communicating by radio with base camp and climbers lower on the mountain as the storm worsened around him, describing brutal winds and deteriorating visibility while attempting to assist Hansen on the descent. Nearby, Mountain Madness guide Scott Fisher was also struggling high on the ridge after becoming severely exhausted during the summit push. Some climbers later recalled hearing voices moving through the whiteout without ever seeing the people speaking. In storms at extreme altitude, sound behaved strangely against the ice slopes and surrounding ridges. Wind carried fragments of conversation across the mountain while hiding the source entirely behind blowing snow and darkness. Several stranded climbers became separated from their teammates while descending toward the South Col, drifting away from the fixed ropes in conditions where orientation disappeared almost immediately. Japanese climber Yasuko Namba and American climber Beck Weathers eventually collapsed with others near Camp 4 after wandering through the storm for hours unable to locate their tents. Rescuers searching through the darkness later described passing human figures that appeared only briefly beneath headlamp beams before vanishing again into the whiteout. Inside the storm, even experienced guides struggled to identify the route back toward camp as darkness and altitude steadily stripped away concentration. Anatoly Bokreev, a guide with the Mountain Madness expedition, later described how wind speeds reached violent intensity across the South Col while climbers stumbled through deep snow barely capable of standing upright. Frostbite spread rapidly through exposed skin, oxygen masks froze against faces. Some climbers became too weak to clip themselves properly onto ropes or adjust malfunctioning regulators. Others simply stopped moving altogether, overcome by exhaustion, after nearly 20 hours above 8,000 meters. In the death zone, the body consumed itself for survival, and once climbers lost the ability to generate heat or think clearly, recovery became increasingly unlikely. Hours after sunset, the South Col turned into a field of moving shadows where headlamps appeared briefly through the snow before vanishing again. Small rescue attempts emerged from Camp 4 despite the conditions, with Sherpas and guides leaving the relative shelter of their tents to search for missing climbers scattered across the slope. The effort carried enormous risk, because rescuers themselves were already physically depleted from their own summit attempts and prolonged exposure to extreme altitude. Bukreev repeatedly moved back into the storm searching for stranded climbers, while other guides attempted to identify figures lying partially buried in snowdrifts outside camp. Several survivors later admitted they had begun accepting death while lying exposed on the mountain, too weak to continue moving and increasingly unable to distinguish dreams from reality beneath the cold. Farther up the mountain, Rob Hall continued transmitting from high on the ridge, while worsening weather isolated him from the rest of the expedition. His radio conversations with base camp gradually revealed how completely the storm had trapped climbers above the south summit. Andy Harris, one of Hall's guides, disappeared while attempting to bring oxygen to Hall and Hansen during the night, becoming lost somewhere in the blizzard above the ridge. Fisher remained stranded farther below after collapsing during the descent near the balcony. Across Everest, climbers and rescuers struggled through separate crises unfolding simultaneously in darkness, many of them unable to see one another despite being positioned only short distances apart on the mountain. By morning, scattered figures were still lying exposed above Camp 4 as exhausted climbers prepared to climb back into conditions that had already begun killing people, into the death zone to bring them back. Inside the torn tents at Camp 4, survivors listened to the wind battering the South Col, while unanswered radio calls continued fading into static. Morning light revealed a landscape that no longer resembled the crowded summit camp climbers had left the previous evening. Snow had partially buried tents along the col, fixed ropes disappeared beneath drifts of ice, and exhausted climbers lay inside cramped shelters struggling to remove frozen boots and oxygen masks from skin already damaged by frostbite. Some had descended through the blizzard with almost no memory of reaching camp at all. Others woke to discover that climbers they had spoken with only hours earlier were still missing somewhere high above the ridge. At nearly 26,000 feet, even survival inside the tents remained uncertain, because the death zone allowed almost no recovery, no matter how long someone rested. Frost crept across oxygen regulators and sleeping bags as climbers struggled to determine who had actually returned from the mountain during the night. The storm had scattered summit teams across Everest in ways that were difficult to reconstruct afterward, even through survivor testimony and radio logs. Several climbers arrived at Camp 4 long after midnight, suffering from hypothermia, snow blindness, or severe oxygen deprivation, barely capable of speaking coherently once inside shelter. Others wandered through the darkness outside the tents before collapsing in the snow only short distances from camp. The South Col itself sat exposed between Everest and Lhotse, like a frozen corridor where hurricane-force winds swept continuously across the plateau, carrying loose snow through gaps in tents and burying climbing equipment left unsecured during the night. No clear count existed for the missing once daylight exposed how many climbers and guides were still stranded somewhere above the ridge. Expedition leaders attempted to piece together incomplete information from exhausted survivors whose memory had already been distorted by hypoxia and trauma. Names surfaced repeatedly through fragmented conversations inside the tents. Rob Hall remained somewhere high near the south summit. Scott Fisher had not returned. Doug Hansen was missing. Andy Harris had disappeared while attempting to carry oxygen uphill during the storm. Yasko Namba and Beck Weathers had been found outside camp during the night, among a group of collapsed climbers exposed to the storm for hours. Some rescuers believed others might still be alive higher on the route, though no one could say with certainty how long any climber could survive, exposed above 8,000 meters after an entire night in the blizzard. Across the camp, exhausted Sherpas melted snow in silence, while rescue plans began forming between climbers who could barely remain standing themselves. High-altitude rescue on Everest had always carried brutal limitations because every climber above the death zone already functioned near the edge of physical collapse. Even healthy climbers struggled to lift their own equipment or move efficiently through deep snow after prolonged exposure at extreme altitude. Carrying another person downward from the southeast ridge required enormous strength, coordination, and oxygen reserves that few people still possessed after the summit push. Yet despite those realities, several guides and Sherpas began preparing to climb upward again, almost immediately after descending from the storm. Even at rest inside the death zone, the human body continued deteriorating fast enough that recovery between rescue attempts was almost impossible. Climbers drank melted snow and forced themselves to eat small amounts of frozen food while trying to restore enough energy to function outside again. Many suffered from dehydration severe enough to impair coordination and judgment. Frostbite had blackened fingers and toes during the night, while coughing caused by ice crystals inside the lungs echoed constantly through the camp. Some survivors later described the strange emotional numbness that settled over Camp 4 that morning, as though exhaustion had temporarily suppressed panic itself. Decisions that would have seemed unthinkable at lower altitude were now discussed with quiet acceptance, because nobody expected rescue helicopters or outside assistance to reach them at that elevation. Fresh footprints leading back upward from Camp 4 soon became the only signs that some climbers had chosen to re-enter the storm. Among those repeatedly moving away from camp was Anatoly Bukriv, the Kazakh guide from the Mountain Madness expedition, who had descended ahead of many clients before the blizzard fully intensified. After resting briefly at Camp 4, Bukriv began climbing back into the whiteout, carrying spare oxygen and hot tea towards stranded climbers lying exposed above camp. Other Sherpas and guides followed separate sections of the route, searching for missing teammates near the southeast ridge and balcony. Several rescuers later admitted they understood the danger clearly before leaving camp again. The storm had not fully passed, visibility remained unstable, and many rescuers themselves were already physically compromised from exhaustion and oxygen deprivation. Beyond the South Col, abandoned gloves, oxygen bottles, and frozen climbing gear marked sections of the route where the descent had begun collapsing hours earlier. In daylight, Everest revealed evidence of the previous night's chaos scattered across the slopes. Snow partially buried crampons, backpacks, and sections of rope, abandoned by climbers who no longer possessed the strength or awareness to carry them farther. Some oxygen cylinders had rolled down steep ice faces after being dropped during the storm. Others remained clipped beside the route where climbers stopped to change regulators or rest before becoming disoriented in the whiteout. Survivors climbing back upward later described the unsettling silence that settled over the mountain after the storm weakened, broken only by wind moving across exposed rock and the metallic sound of carabiners striking fixed rope. Several rescuers moving toward the southeast ridge discovered motionless figures attached to fixed ropes whose identities could not immediately be confirmed beneath layers of ice and snow. At extreme altitude, hypothermia and oxygen deprivation often reduced climbers to near immobility, leaving rescuers uncertain whether someone had died or simply lost consciousness beneath frozen clothing and masks. Some climbers found during the searches showed faint signs of movement only after rescuers removed ice from oxygen regulators or forced them to respond verbally. Others never regained awareness. Rescue decisions became increasingly brutal because moving an incapacitated climber downward required multiple people who were themselves barely capable of remaining upright. In several cases, rescuers were forced to leave climbers temporarily in the snow while searching for oxygen or additional help farther down the mountain. Through brief breaks in the weather, distant shapes occasionally appeared along the mountain before disappearing again behind blowing cloud. The scale of Everest distorted perception badly enough that climbers often misjudged distance between themselves and other figures on the ridge. Someone appearing only a short distance uphill could require an hour or more of climbing to reach through deep snow and high wind. Rescuers searching above Camp 4 repeatedly encountered uncertainty about whether figures seen higher on the mountain were moving survivors, abandoned equipment, or bodies partially exposed through drifting snow. radio communication remained inconsistent throughout the searches, forcing guides and Sherpas to make decisions independently, while isolated across different sections of the route. Few climbers above 8,000 meters possessed enough strength to assist anyone else, forcing rescuers to make decisions that would later haunt survivors for years. Some stranded climbers could still walk with support if given oxygen and guidance back toward camp. Others had deteriorated beyond movement entirely. Guides and Sherpas confronted the reality that attempting to save one person sometimes endangered everyone involved in the rescue. Survivors later described seeing rescuers physically dragging climbers through snow while collapsing themselves from exhaustion every few minutes. Even basic tasks such as clipping safety lines or adjusting crampons became agonizingly slow after prolonged exposure in the death zone. Anatoly Bukriv repeatedly left the relative shelter of Camp 4 carrying oxygen and hot drinks towards stranded climbers scattered across the slope. During multiple rescue trips through the storm and its aftermath, Bukriv helped locate and assist several climbers who had collapsed outside camp, including members of the group found exposed near the South Col after wandering in the blizzard overnight. Survivors later recalled seeing him disappear repeatedly into darkness, while many climbers inside the tents remained too exhausted to move. Debate would later surround some of Bukriv's decisions during the expedition, particularly his choice to descend ahead of clients without supplemental oxygen during the summit push. Yet even critics acknowledged the extraordinary physical effort involved in the rescue attempts that followed. Farther from camp, Sherpas climbing through deep snow searched for survivors in areas where visibility and wind had erased nearly every trace of the route. Some rescuers advanced toward the balcony and sections below the south summit, hoping to locate climbers last reported alive during the storm. The mountain remained dangerously unstable, despite improving visibility in some areas. Snow concealed sections of rope beneath ice accumulation, while exhausted rescuers risked slipping across steep slopes where self-arrest would have been nearly impossible. Above them, the upper ridge of Everest remained partly obscured by moving cloud, concealing whatever still remained scattered across the mountain after the blizzard. By late afternoon, rescuers returning to Camp 4 collapsed inside tents, still wearing ice-covered harnesses and crampons because removing equipment required more energy than they possessed. Many had now spent nearly 2 full days operating inside the death zone, with little sleep, food, or oxygen. Some climbers drifted in and out of consciousness, while others continued preparing additional rescue equipment in case radio calls or sightings revealed survivors still stranded above the South Col. The atmosphere inside the camp had changed completely from the ambition and anticipation that existed before the summit push. Everest was no longer a mountain being climbed. It had become a place where exhausted survivors waited for voices on the radio, distant figures in the snow, or signs that someone else might still return alive. Long after most climbers at Camp 4 had stopped believing additional survivors could still be reached, a single light continued moving slowly upward through the storm. The night Anatoly Bukriv walked back alone, a single headlamp continued drifting upward beyond Camp 4 long after most climbers had stopped expecting anyone else to survive the night. From inside the battered tents along the South Col, the moving light appeared small against the enormous darkness surrounding Everest, occasionally vanishing behind curtains of blowing snow before reappearing farther up the slope. Wind swept continuously across the camp at nearly 8,000 meters, rattling frozen nylon and carrying loose ice crystals through gaps in the shelters, where exhausted survivors lay motionless inside sleeping bags stiffened by frost. Hours earlier, climbers descending from the summit had stumbled blindly through hurricane-force conditions that scattered people across the southeast ridge and buried sections of the route beneath drifting snow. By the time the storm weakened enough for rescuers to search outside camp again, many climbers already believed the mountain had taken everyone still missing above the South Col. Beneath layers of ice-covered fabric inside the tents, exhausted survivors struggled to stay conscious while the wind shook the South Col without pause. Several climbers who had returned from the blizzard remained unable to speak coherently because of hypoxia, dehydration, and prolonged exposure at extreme altitude. Oxygen masks froze against faces during the night, forcing climbers to tear them away repeatedly to clear accumulating ice from the valves. Frostbite spread through hands and feet despite multiple layers of insulated clothing, while persistent coughing echoed through the camp as lungs reacted to inhaling air cold enough to damage tissue with every breath. At that elevation, Even sleeping became dangerous because the body continued deteriorating regardless of rest, consuming oxygen faster than it could recover. Very few rescuers remaining at camp possessed enough strength to climb again after nearly 2 days spent above 8,000 meters. Most climbers who had survived the storm could barely stand without assistance once inside the tents. Some remained partially delirious after descending through whiteout conditions where visibility disappeared completely for hours at a time. Others drifted in and out of consciousness, while Sherpas melted snow over small stoves to provide water that many survivors no longer possessed the strength to drink properly. Yet somewhere above the camp, stranded climbers still remained exposed on the mountain, and the possibility that some might still be alive forced rescuers to confront an almost impossible decision. Every trip back into the death zone risked creating additional victims among people already physically destroyed by the summit push and blizzard. Across the frozen plateau below the ridge, scattered footprints disappeared almost immediately beneath blowing snow and darkness. The South Col had become strangely empty after the chaos of the storm, stripped down to isolated tents, abandoned gear, and distant shadows moving through the wind. Sections of fixed rope vibrated against ice where the route climbed upward toward the balcony and southeast ridge. Half-buried oxygen cylinders protruded from the snow beside dropped gloves, broken goggles and climbing equipment discarded during the descent when exhausted climbers no longer possessed the coordination to secure them properly. Survivors later described how the mountain seemed almost silent after the blizzard passed, broken only by the wind and the metallic sound of crampons striking frozen ground. Anatoly Bukriv moved away from the tents carrying spare oxygen and hot tea toward figures barely visible against the slope. Unlike many commercial guides climbing Everest that season, Bukriv often climbed without supplemental oxygen during summit pushes, a controversial practice that became heavily debated after the disaster. On the night of the storm, however, his physical conditioning allowed him to continue moving through conditions that had already overwhelmed many other climbers. After descending safely to Camp 4 earlier in the blizzard, Bukriv rested briefly before leaving camp repeatedly to search for stranded climbers scattered across the South Col. Witnesses later recalled watching his headlamp disappear into darkness, while most survivors inside the tents remained too exhausted even to assist with preparations. Loose sections of fixed rope rattled in the wind as rescuers climbed through areas where abandoned gear still marked the previous night's descent. Conditions above Camp 4 remained dangerous despite slight improvements in visibility, because fresh snow concealed parts of the route and ice accumulation made movement unstable along exposed sections of slope. Climbers attempting rescue searches moved slowly through deep drifts while carrying oxygen cylinders, hot fluids, and spare masks toward areas where survivors had last been seen during the storm. Every movement demanded concentration because exhaustion at that altitude often caused climbers to lose coordination without warning. Several rescuers later admitted they feared falling asleep while standing upright during the searches. Some climbers lying above Camp 4 appeared indistinguishable from bodies until faint movement beneath the snow revealed they were still alive. Bukriv eventually located members of a group stranded outside camp after wandering through the blizzard for hours, including Beck Weathers, Hayasuko Namba, and other climbers who had collapsed near the South Col unable to continue moving. Snow had partially buried several of them during the night, while oxygen deprivation and hypothermia left survivors barely responsive when rescuers attempted to communicate with them. At extreme altitude, severe hypothermia often slowed breathing and movement so dramatically that climbers could appear dead even while still conscious beneath layers of frozen clothing. Far from the relative shelter of the camp, voices occasionally emerged through the darkness before vanishing again into the storm. Survivors later described the strange psychological effects produced by prolonged exposure at extreme altitude, where exhaustion, hypoxia, and isolation distorted sound and perception across the mountain. Some rescuers searching above camp believed they heard climbers speaking somewhere beyond visibility, only to discover empty slopes moments later. Others encountered figures moving slowly through the snow who disappeared again before they could be reached. The South Col itself existed at an altitude where human cognition deteriorated rapidly, and after nearly 48 hours of climbing, descending, and rescue work, many people on the mountain struggled to separate memory from immediate reality. Repeated trips across the South Col gradually left rescuers themselves struggling to walk, speak clearly, or remain awake inside the tents. Sherpas and guides returning from searches collapsed onto sleeping bags without removing crampons or harnesses because simple physical tasks required more energy than they possessed. Frost formed along the inside walls of the tents from moisture carried in through breathing and melting snow. Some climbers experienced temporary blindness from prolonged exposure to wind and reflected ice crystals, while others developed frostbite severe enough to permanently damage fingers, toes, and facial tissue. Yet despite their condition, rescuers continued preparing oxygen cylinders and climbing equipment for additional searches whenever reports suggested survivors might still remain exposed somewhere above camp. Several survivors later remembered watching isolated headlamps moving through the night, while much of the mountain remained completely silent. From inside the tents, those distant lights became the only visible signs that rescue attempts were continuing outside the camp. Bucrive repeatedly disappeared into darkness, carrying supplies uphill before returning hours later, escorting weakened climbers back through the snow. The physical effort involved in those rescues was extraordinary even by Himalayan climbing standards, because carrying or guiding incapacitated climbers at nearly 8,000 meters required enormous strength under conditions where most people struggled simply to survive themselves. Survivors later recalled how the movement of a single headlamp across the South Col gradually became one of the few reassuring sights remaining on the mountain. Inside oxygen masks coated with frozen condensation, breathing became so difficult that some climbers tore the masks away despite the altitude. Oxygen regulators malfunctioned repeatedly after exposure to moisture and freezing wind, forcing rescuers to clear valves manually while suffering from numb hands and failing coordination. Several climbers rescued from the slopes remained unable to walk independently, even after receiving oxygen, because prolonged exposure had left them severely hypothermic and mentally disoriented. Others could no longer recognize rescuers or understand instructions once they reached the tents. The disaster unfolding across Everest had moved beyond climbing entirely. Survival now depended on keeping injured climbers conscious, hydrated, and protected from temperatures cold enough to freeze exposed skin within minutes. Each return from the slope brought more signs of physical collapse as frostbite spread through hands, faces, and feet already damaged beyond recovery. Climbers inside Camp 4 began realizing that surviving the storm itself did not guarantee survival afterward, because injuries continued worsening even inside shelter. Blackened fingertips, swollen eyes, and frozen tissue became increasingly common throughout the camp. Some survivors later required amputations after descending from Everest, while others carried permanent neurological damage caused by oxygen deprivation at extreme altitude. Yet during the night of the rescue attempts, few climbers focused on long-term consequences, because too many people still remained trapped between life and death on the mountain outside. Through brief openings in the cloud, motionless shapes could still be seen higher on the ridge where the storm had scattered climbers during the descent. Rob Hall remained stranded high near the south summit, still communicating intermittently by radio despite catastrophic conditions and rapidly deteriorating physical condition. Scott Fisher also remained above camp after collapsing during the descent. Lower on the mountain, rescuers continued searching through darkness for survivors scattered near the South Col, while fighting exhaustion severe enough to impair their own judgment and coordination. Every trip back into the storm carried the possibility that rescuers themselves would no longer return. Near the end of the night, the climbers pulled from the snow still lay silent inside the tents, while frost slowly sealed itself across their sleeping bags and oxygen masks. Yasuko Namba, Beck Weathers, and the frozen camp. Ice crusted over the inside of the tents at Camp 4 as exhausted climbers tried to make sense of who among the survivors still had a chance to endure what remained of the night. The storm had passed, but its consequences had not, leaving the South Col transformed into a frozen staging ground of collapsed bodies, fractured communication, and incomplete rescues that could not yet be fully accounted for. Inside the cramped shelters, every surface carried signs of prolonged exposure: damp fabric frozen into stiffness, oxygen cylinders coated in rime, and sleeping bags hardened by repeated cycles of melt and refreeze from exhausted breathing. The mountain outside had gone quiet in the way it often did after extreme weather, not peaceful, but emptied of immediate motion, as though Everest itself was holding its breath while the aftermath unfolded below. Inside the cramped shelters along the South Col, oxygen masks froze against faces each time weakened climbers attempted to breathe through them. At this altitude, oxygen systems that functioned reliably at lower elevations became fragile. frequently clogging or freezing due to moisture and extreme cold, forcing climbers to constantly adjust regulators with numb hands. Many survivors remained barely conscious, their condition shaped not only by exhaustion, but by prolonged oxygen deprivation that affected memory, coordination, and even recognition of people nearby. Voices inside the tents were reduced to short, fragmented exchanges, often repeated because climbers could not be certain whether instructions had been heard or understood. Outside, wind still moved across the plateau in long, continuous gusts, pushing fine snow into every opening and ensuring that nothing remained completely dry or stable for long. Hardly any movement could be seen from several of the figures lying inside the camp after the rescue efforts had ceased for the moment. Some climbers who had been brought down from the storm remained motionless for hours, their condition difficult to interpret even for experienced guides familiar with high-altitude survival. Hypothermia at this elevation does not progress gently, but collapses the body's systems unevenly, sometimes leaving individuals appearing lifeless while still retaining faint signs of awareness. Inside Camp 4, rescuers moved carefully between figures laid across sleeping bags and tent floors, attempting to identify who required immediate attention and who could no longer be helped with the resources available. Every decision was constrained by physical exhaustion, limited oxygen supplies, and the simple reality that no external evacuation would reach them at nearly 8,000 meters. Yasuko Namba remained severely hypothermic after hours exposed outside the tents during the blizzard near the South Col. She had been part of the group that became separated during the descent when visibility collapsed, eventually ending up outside Camp 4 in conditions that offered no orientation or shelter. By the time she was located, her body temperature had fallen dangerously low, and her responsiveness was minimal, requiring immediate assistance from nearby climbers who themselves were barely able to function. At extreme altitude, recovery from such exposure becomes uncertain even under ideal conditions. And inside Camp 4 there were no ideal conditions, only exhausted rescuers attempting to stabilize people with rapidly diminishing strength. Beckwethers lay among other near-unconscious climbers, while rescuers struggled to decide who could realistically be brought back from the edge of death at that altitude. Earlier reports from the storm had led many to believe he would not survive the night after he was left outside in near-total whiteout conditions, with no active rescue plan available at the time. His condition on return to Camp 4 was catastrophic, marked by severe frostbite and profound hypothermia that left him largely unresponsive for extended periods. In high-altitude disasters like Everest, such assessments often become immediate and brutal, as climbers and guides must prioritize limited oxygen, physical capacity, and the likelihood of survival over emotional judgment. The presence of multiple critically injured climbers inside the camp meant that no single rescue effort could be fully devoted to any one individual for long. At nearly 8,000 meters above sea level, even basic treatment was constrained by exhaustion, frozen equipment, and critically limited oxygen reserves. Medical care in this environment does not resemble structured intervention, but instead becomes a sequence of improvised actions, warming small quantities of water, repositioning oxygen masks, attempting to restore circulation in frozen limbs, and monitoring consciousness in conditions where sleep deprivation and hypoxia distort perception. Many of the rescuers themselves were operating under the same physiological limitations as those they were trying to assist, making sustained attention difficult and increasing the risk of errors. Camp 4, once a point of coordination for summit attempts, had effectively become a temporary triage zone with no guarantee of further support. Some rescuers later admitted they could no longer distinguish between climbers who were unconscious and those who had already slipped beyond recovery. This uncertainty was not the result of inexperience, but of the extreme environmental conditions in which visual cues became unreliable and the body's responses were often delayed or absent. Frostbite altered appearance dramatically, darkening skin and stiffening facial features in ways that made recognition difficult, even among team members who had climbed together for weeks. Oxygen deprivation further complicated assessment, as climbers in deep hypoxia could appear lifeless, while still retaining minimal signs of physiological activity. Within the tents, moments of uncertainty became frequent, with rescuers repeatedly returning to check on individuals who had not moved for hours. Blackened skin and frozen tissue became more visible as daylight revealed the full extent of damage caused by the storm. When morning light finally reached the South Col, it exposed a landscape that had been obscured for nearly a full day. Abandoned equipment partially buried in snow, tents warped by wind, and climbers lying in positions that suggested both exhaustion and collapse. Frostbite injuries, particularly to fingers, toes, and exposed facial areas, appeared more severe under daylight, confirming what many had already suspected during the night. The visual clarity of morning did not bring relief, only confirmation that the storm's effects had been far more extensive than could be fully understood in darkness. Very little conversation survived inside the tents beyond short exchanges about oxygen, frostbite, and the condition of those still fading in and out of awareness. Communication had become functional rather than emotional, focused entirely on immediate survival needs rather than reflection or planning beyond the next few hours. Climbers spoke in short phrases, often repeating themselves or pausing mid-sentence as exhaustion interrupted thought. Outside the tents, the wind remained constant, pressing against fabric walls and carrying fine snow into every seam. Inside, the sound of breathing through oxygen masks created a steady rhythm that marked time more clearly than any clock or schedule could. Against all expectation, movement was eventually noticed from Beck Weathers, hours after many inside Camp 4 believed he would not survive the exposure. His return to awareness was not immediate or stable, but gradual and intermittent, marked by moments of confusion and physical inability to respond consistently to those around him. Survivors later recalled the difficulty of processing his condition, given the severity of his earlier exposure and the assumption that he had already died outside the camp. In the context of Everest disasters, such reversals are rare but not impossible, as extreme hypothermia can sometimes slow bodily functions to the point where survival becomes unpredictable even to experienced climbers. Witnesses later described seeing Weathers walking back toward camp through the cold with severe frostbite and almost no visible responsiveness to his surroundings. His movement toward Camp 4 occurred in conditions where orientation, balance, and decision-making were severely compromised by both physical injury and altitude-related cognitive impairment. The sight of a climber returning under such conditions challenged immediate assumptions about survivability at extreme altitude, where exposure is often considered definitive within short timeframes. Inside the camp, his arrival forced already exhausted rescuers to redirect attention and resources once again, despite the overwhelming number of other climbers still in critical condition. Far above the South Col, radio transmissions from climbers still stranded near the ridge weakened further as conditions on the upper mountain continued to deteriorate. Communication gaps persisted across different sections of the southeast ridge, leaving sections of the expedition unable to confirm the status of key individuals who had been separated during the descent. Signals that once carried clear information during the ascent had degraded into fragments, affected by distance, weather, and failing equipment. For those at Camp 4, each broken transmission reinforced the uncertainty of how many people remained alive higher on the mountain, and how long any of them could possibly survive. From the frozen camp below, survivors could still see sections of Everest disappearing into cloud, where several guides and climbers had yet to return. The mountain above remained visually unstable, shifting between brief moments of clarity and complete obscurity as weather patterns continued moving across the upper slopes. What had begun as a summit attempt had now transformed into an open question, with no clear boundary between rescue and loss. Inside Camp 4, attention gradually turned away from those who had already been brought back, and toward the silent ridge where others were still missing, still unaccounted for, and still somewhere beyond reach. Silence settled over Camp 4 as the remaining climbers realized that the mountain still held people who had not come back at all. The rescuers who never came down. Last transmissions from the upper ridge continued breaking apart into static as Camp 4 struggled to determine who, if anyone, was still alive above the South Col. What had begun as structured communication during the summit push had deteriorated into fragments of speech interrupted by wind noise, weak signals, and sudden drops in clarity that made even basic interpretation uncertain. Radios that once carried clear instructions between expedition leaders and climbers were now reduced to unstable channels that cut in and out without warning. Inside the tents at Camp 4, exhausted survivors leaned toward receivers trying to distinguish meaning from distortion, aware that each broken transmission might represent a climber losing strength, losing oxygen, or losing consciousness somewhere higher on the mountain. Missing coordinates from radio logs left expedition leaders unable to confirm the exact position of the climbers last seen near the balcony and south summit. The upper sections of Everest had become functionally untrackable once visibility collapsed during the storm, and even before that point, delayed descent times had already created uncertainty about where each team member had last been reliably observed. Without visual confirmation or stable radio contact, coordinates recorded earlier in the day quickly became outdated, leaving large portions of the route effectively blank on operational maps. Rescue planning at Camp 4 relied increasingly on approximation rather than precision, with climbers attempting to reconstruct positions based on memory, timing, and fragmented reports from those who had descended earlier. Silence where a voice had been expected stretched longer than any previous gap in communication since the summit push began. At extreme altitude, silence itself became an indicator of deterioration, often suggesting either complete exhaustion, equipment failure, or a climber no longer capable of operating a radio. As hours passed without contact from certain sections of the upper mountain, uncertainty replaced expectation. Climbers inside Camp 4 began to recognize that the absence of communication was not temporary delay but something more permanent in nature. The mountain above had stopped responding in a way that could be corrected or restored through effort alone. Unconfirmed sightings near the south summit suggested movement late into the storm, though no stable visual confirmation could be established afterward. In conditions where wind-driven snow reduced visibility to only a few meters, even experienced climbers struggled to distinguish between human figures, drifting gear, or shifting shadows cast by headlamps. Reports from descending climbers described brief impressions of movement near fixed ropes and exposed ridgelines, but none of these observations could be consistently verified afterward. The upper mountain remained visually unstable, offering only momentary glimpses that disappeared before they could be properly understood or recorded. Fragments of communication fading into static included references to oxygen depletion and inability to continue descent under worsening conditions. Oxygen systems at extreme altitude are critical, not only for physical survival, but for cognitive function, and once supply levels drop below safe thresholds, decision-making becomes increasingly impaired. Transmissions from the upper ridge reflected this deterioration, with messages becoming shorter, less structured, and increasingly difficult to interpret. Words were repeated, interrupted, or left unfinished, suggesting that climbers were speaking under rapidly declining physical conditions. Inside Camp 4, these fragments were analysed repeatedly, as rescuers attempted to determine whether any coherent action was still possible above them. Search efforts unable to reach higher terrain remained constrained by exhaustion, weather instability, and the physical limits of survival above Camp 4. Even experienced high-altitude guides and Sherpas who had survived earlier rescue attempts were operating at the edge of their physical capacity after prolonged exposure in the death zone. The terrain above the South Col offered little margin for error, with steep slopes, unstable snow, and heavily oxygen-depleted conditions that made sustained movement extremely dangerous. Attempts to extend searches farther up the mountain were repeatedly delayed or abandoned due to worsening fatigue among rescuers themselves, creating a situation where operational reach effectively ended well below the last known positions of several climbers. Empty sections of rope leading into cloud marked the last known routes used by climbers who never returned from the upper mountain. Fixed lines that had supported ascent and descent across critical sections of the southeast ridge now hung partially buried in snow or disappeared entirely beneath shifting ice formations. These ropes had once provided structure and orientation during the summit push, but after the storm they became silent indicators of movement that had ceased entirely. Climbing equipment left attached to the lines suggested abrupt interruptions in descent, where climbers may have stopped moving without the ability to continue or communicate further. No further contact from climbers last seen above Camp 4 reinforced the growing realization that parts of the expedition had vanished entirely from communication. Expedition leaders and surviving guides began reconstructing timelines based on the final known transmissions, but gaps in information made any complete understanding impossible. Each attempt to reconcile radio logs with eyewitness accounts produced inconsistencies that could not be resolved with certainty. As time passed, absence replaced uncertainty, and absence itself became the dominant form of information coming from the upper mountain. Radio silence from the south summit persisted even as conditions at lower elevations began to stabilize slightly after the storm. While Camp 4 experienced intermittent improvement in weather, the upper mountain remained sealed within persistent cloud cover that prevented further visual confirmation. Climbers monitoring radio channels continued attempting contact long after responses had ceased, hoping that delayed transmissions or battery recovery might restore communication. None of these attempts succeeded, and the silence gradually took on a finality that could no longer be interpreted as temporary failure. Disappeared positions recorded in expedition notes showed gaps where known climbers had once been accounted for but could no longer be verified. These records, initially maintained for coordination during the summit push, became increasingly incomplete as conditions deteriorated and communication broke down. Names that had been associated with specific sections of the route were gradually marked as unconfirmed, pending, or unknown. The administrative structure of the expedition, once carefully organised, collapsed under the weight of missing information and unrecoverable data. Unanswered transmissions from fixed radios continued briefly before cutting off completely as battery power and signal strength failed. In some cases, radios that had functioned intermittently during the storm transmitted short bursts of sound that contained no usable information, only fragments of noise shaped by wind and altitude interference. Eventually, even these irregular signals ceased entirely, leaving no remaining trace of active communication from the upper mountain. The loss of contact was not marked by a single moment, but by a gradual reduction in signal until nothing remained. Final sightings reported near the ridge described figures moving slowly before disappearing into cloud that never lifted from the upper slopes. These accounts, while consistent across multiple survivors, could not be confirmed due to the extreme limitations of visibility and the rapid changes in weather conditions at that altitude. The upper ridge remained one of the most exposed and unstable sections of Everest, where movement could be briefly visible before being erased by shifting cloud and snowfall. As a result, final sightings became less like observations and more like impressions, recorded without the ability to verify their continuation. Absence became the only consistent pattern across all remaining records from climbers who had attempted to assist others near the south summit. Every available account, whether written, spoken, or transmitted through radio, converged on the same unresolved condition: contact established, then lost, without recovery. The consistency of this pattern reinforced the understanding that the upper mountain had ceased to function as a navigable environment for rescue or return. What remained was not a location that could be reached, but a zone where communication ended permanently. No further trace of movement could be confirmed above the highest fixed camps once the storm fully separated the upper mountain from observation. Even when weather conditions improved slightly at lower elevations, the upper regions of Everest remained visually inaccessible, concealed behind persistent cloud formations and extreme distance. Climbers observing from Camp 4 could only infer conditions above them based on absence rather than evidence. The mountain's higher sections effectively ceased to be part of active expedition knowledge, existing only as unverified space beyond reach. Last known signals from the highest routes ceased without return, leaving only silence where coordinated rescue efforts had once been attempted. What remained was not simply the absence of communication, but the collapse of any expectation that communication would resume. For those still at Camp 4, this silence marked the end of operational rescue possibilities above a certain altitude, redefining the disaster not as an ongoing event, but as something already concluded beyond their reach. Nothing on the upper mountain indicated survival after that point, as all remaining communication collapsed into irreversible silence. After the storm, the arguments began. Survivor accounts recorded after descent began to circulate through base camp as climbers attempted to piece together what had actually occurred above Camp 4. What had once been an immediate survival situation on the upper slopes of Everest quickly transformed into fragmented recollection, shaped by exhaustion, hypoxia, and the psychological shock of what had unfolded during the storm. At base camp and in lower settlements, climbers who had only recently been fighting for their lives now found themselves sitting in relative safety, trying to describe events that had taken place in conditions where perception itself had been unreliable. The shift from survival to explanation created an immediate tension as memory and documentation began to compete for authority over what the mountain had witnessed. Conflicting reports emerging from expedition logs revealed immediate inconsistencies in timing, positioning, and the sequence of events during the summit descent. Different teams had maintained separate communication systems, and radio logs recorded at altitude often failed to align with later recollections from those who had descended. Some climbers placed critical events hours apart from one another, while others described encounters and movements that could not be matched to verified timestamps. The structure of the expedition itself, divided among multiple commercial teams operating simultaneously on the same route, contributed to overlapping accounts that could not be easily reconciled. Even basic elements such as who had reached the summit at what time became points of divergence rather than shared fact. Early reconstructions of the summit timeline struggled to align radio transmissions with eyewitness accounts from climbers who had returned through the storm. Transmissions captured during the descent were often incomplete, interrupted by wind noise, weak signals, or sudden loss of contact at critical moments. When these fragments were later compared to survivor testimony, discrepancies became apparent not only in timing but in interpretation of urgency and intent. A message that sounded routine to one listener was later understood as a sign of distress by another. In the absence of a continuous record, the expedition had to be reconstructed from discontinuous evidence, leaving large portions of the narrative dependent on inference rather than confirmation. Disagreements between guides and clients surfaced as interpretations of turnaround times and descent decisions began to diverge under post-expedition scrutiny. Turnaround times, established as safety boundaries during high-altitude climbs, became central to later debates about decision-making on Everest that season. Some climbers adhered strictly to predetermined limits, while others continued toward the summit despite deteriorating conditions and delayed progress. After the disaster, accounts differed on how clearly those limits had been communicated and how effectively they had been enforced in real time. The difficulty of applying fixed rules in rapidly changing conditions became a recurring point of tension in later discussions among those who had participated in the expedition. Analysis of decision points above Camp 4 increasingly focused on oxygen depletion, delayed summit arrivals, and the physical limits imposed by extreme altitude. At elevations above 8,000 meters, the human body operates under continuous physiological strain, with reduced oxygen levels affecting cognitive processing, coordination, and judgment. These conditions were widely acknowledged in mountaineering literature even before the 1996 season, yet their impact became central to understanding how decisions had been made during the final ascent and descent. Delays caused by bottlenecks on the route further compounded these effects, creating cascading consequences that extended far beyond individual choices. In retrospective analysis, these factors were frequently cited as structural pressures rather than isolated errors. Debates over turnaround times and weather interpretation reflected broader uncertainty about how rapidly conditions deteriorated during the afternoon of May 10th. Weather patterns on Everest can shift dramatically within short periods, and climbers operating near the summit often rely on visual cues that become unreliable under changing conditions. During the 1996 expedition, several teams encountered worsening weather at different points along the route, leading to varied interpretations of when conditions had crossed critical thresholds. Some accounts described relatively manageable conditions during portions of the ascent, while others emphasized sudden and severe deterioration during descent. These differences contributed to ongoing disagreement about whether earlier descent might have altered outcomes. Retrospective accounts written months later introduced additional variations in memory, shaped by trauma, hypoxia, and the passage of time after the expedition ended. Psychological studies of high-altitude exposure suggest that prolonged oxygen deprivation can affect memory consolidation, sometimes resulting in incomplete or altered recollection of events experienced under extreme stress. Climbers returning from Everest often described gaps in memory surrounding specific segments of their descent, particularly during periods of severe exhaustion or disorientation. As time passed, these gaps were filled differently by different individuals, creating parallel narratives that reflected both experience and reconstruction. The written accounts that emerged after the expedition, therefore, represented not only what had been observed, but how those observations were later understood. Unresolved questions about rescue feasibility continued to surface as accounts differed on whether additional climbers could realistically have been reached during the storm. Rescue operations at extreme altitude are constrained by physical endurance, oxygen availability, and environmental exposure, all of which were severely limited during the 1996 disaster. Some accounts suggested that further attempts might have been possible under different conditions, while others emphasized the immediate exhaustion of rescuers already operating at their physiological limits. the debate remained centred not only on what was done, but on what could have been done within the constraints of the environment. No consensus emerged that fully resolved these competing interpretations. Further examination of expedition communications revealed gaps where radio contact had failed to capture critical moments during the descent. Communication systems used during the climb were subject to interference from weather, terrain, and equipment limitations, resulting in incomplete transmission records. These gaps meant that key decisions and developments were not fully documented in real time, leaving later analysis dependent on partial information. In some cases, climbers who were believed to be in contact with base camp were later found to have been out of range or unable to transmit effectively. The absence of continuous communication created structural uncertainty that extended into every subsequent interpretation of the event. Contradictory recollections from climbers who reached Camp 4 highlighted how differently the same events were experienced under extreme physiological stress. At high altitude, perception is often shaped by fatigue, oxygen deprivation, and environmental exposure, leading to variations in how identical situations are later described. Some climbers recalled organised descent efforts, while others remembered fragmentation and separation across the mountain. These differences were not necessarily contradictions of intent, but reflections of how conditions influenced awareness at the time. The result was a collection of accounts that diverged in detail, while sharing a common recognition of extreme difficulty. Documentation from commercial expedition operators emphasized logistical challenges posed by crowded summit conditions and simultaneous team movements on the mountain. The 1996 season saw multiple guided expeditions operating along the same route, creating congestion at critical bottlenecks such as fixed ropes and narrow ridge sections. This overlap increased waiting times at extreme altitudes, contributing to delays that compounded exposure risks for climbers already operating near physiological limits. Operational records from the season highlighted the complexity of coordinating multiple groups in an environment where communication, visibility, and mobility were all severely constrained. Physiological studies of high-altitude cognition were later referenced to explain how oxygen deprivation can alter judgment, coordination, and memory formation. Research conducted in hypoxic environments has demonstrated measurable effects on decision-making speed, attention, and risk assessment, particularly above extreme altitude thresholds. These findings were frequently cited in later analyses of the 1996 expedition to contextualize the conditions under which decisions were made. While such studies did not assign responsibility, they provided a framework for understanding how even experienced climbers could experience impaired judgment without immediate awareness of decline. Re-evaluations of the 1996 climbing season placed the disaster within a broader pattern of increasing commercial activity on Everest. As guided expeditions became more common in the 1990s, the number of climbers attempting the summit increased significantly, leading to greater congestion on established routes. This shift introduced new logistical challenges that were still being adapted to at the time of the disaster. Later analyses examined how these changes affected decision-making structures, resource allocation, and risk distribution across multiple teams operating simultaneously at extreme altitude. Persistent disagreement among surviving climbers ensured that no single account fully resolved the sequence of decisions made above the South Summit. Even among those who shared similar experiences on the mountain, interpretations of key moments continued to diverge in detail and emphasis. Some accounts focused on timing, others on communication, and others on environmental change, each contributing a different lens through which the expedition could be understood. The absence of a unified narrative reflected not only the complexity of the event, but the limitations of human perception under extreme conditions. Historical analyses of the expedition continued to expand as new interviews and interpretations added further complexity to the established narrative. Over time, the disaster became the subject of ongoing study within mountaineering literature, journalism, and physiological research, each discipline contributing different perspectives on what had occurred. As additional information emerged, earlier conclusions were revisited, adjusted, or questioned in light of new evidence or reinterpretation of existing records. The result was not a single definitive account, but a layered and evolving understanding of the expedition shaped by multiple disciplines. Even years later, the same summit day remained divided across competing versions of truth that could not be fully reconciled into one account. What occurred on Everest in 1996 continued to exist simultaneously as documented fact, survivor memory, and analytical reconstruction, each carrying its own limitations and uncertainties. The mountain itself had long since ceased to be the site of active rescue, yet it remained central to ongoing attempts at understanding what had unfolded above Camp 4. No final interpretation succeeded in closing the gap between experience and explanation. What remained unquestioned was the presence of physical evidence still fixed in the mountain long after every testimony had been spoken. The mountain kept the evidence. At extreme altitude, objects do not disappear quickly, and Everest retains what is left behind with a permanence that lower environments cannot replicate. The mountain does not process loss in the way inhabited environments do, where weather, vegetation, and human activity gradually erase traces of events. Instead, above 8,000 meters, cold, thin air and reduced biological activity create conditions where remnants remain exposed or partially preserved for years, sometimes decades, until shifting ice or snow slowly alters their position. What occurred during the 1996 disaster did not dissolve into absence after the storm passed. It remained distributed across ridges, slopes and camps, embedded into the geography itself. Beneath the South Col, remnants of equipment remain fixed in ice, marking the paths where climbers once moved through deteriorating conditions. Oxygen bottles, fragments of torn fabric and broken climbing hardware are frequently cited among the types of equipment left behind in high-altitude zones where recovery becomes impossible. These objects are not simply discarded. They are abandoned under conditions where carrying them further would have meant additional risk or where the climber no longer had the physical capacity to continue. Over time, they become partially embedded in snow layers that compress and harden, preserving their position while slowly altering their appearance. Along the southeast ridge, bodies mark unchanging points in the landscape, positioned where final movement ceased during the storm. In high-altitude mountaineering, it is an acknowledged reality that not all climbers can be recovered once they have died in the death zone, due to the extreme difficulty and danger involved in retrieval operations. As a result, certain locations on Everest function as fixed spatial references, where the positions of climbers who did not return remain part of the mountain's visible structure. These points do not shift with narrative or time. They remain where conditions ultimately stopped all movement. Scattered gear continues to define the route long after expeditions end, forming an unintended map of decisions made under extreme exhaustion. Fixed ropes, carabiners, and anchor systems left along established routes become semi-permanent features of the climbing infrastructure, particularly in sections where removal would require additional exposure to risk. During the 1996 season, as multiple teams moved through the same corridors of ascent and descent, equipment was left behind in increasing frequency as conditions deteriorated. Over time, these remnants form a kind of layered record of passage, indicating where climbers stopped, rested, or could no longer proceed. Recovered radio logs preserve fragments of final transmissions that capture only partial moments of the descent from the upper mountain. Unlike continuous recordings, these logs consist of intermittent communication bursts recorded at base camp or relay points, often disrupted by environmental interference. They include incomplete messages, abrupt endings, and sections lost entirely to static or signal failure. When later reviewed, these fragments provide timing markers but rarely complete context, leaving interpretation dependent on surrounding accounts. The result is a communication record that documents presence without fully capturing meaning. Recorded signals capture isolated bursts of communication that ended abruptly, leaving gaps where critical exchanges should have occurred. In the context of the 1996 Everest expedition, these gaps represent not just technical failure, but the limits of communication infrastructure operating at extreme altitude. Radio systems were vulnerable to battery depletion, cold-induced malfunction, and line-of-sight obstruction caused by terrain and weather. As a result, certain moments of the descent are known only through the fact that communication stopped, not through what was said immediately before or after. Survivor accounts diverge from what remains physically present on the mountain, creating tension between memory and material evidence. Climbers who returned from the upper slopes carried recollections shaped by extreme fatigue, hypoxia, and psychological stress, all of which are known to affect memory formation and recall. These accounts often provide essential insight into sequence and experience, but do not always align perfectly with physical findings on the mountain. This divergence does not invalidate either source but highlights the difficulty of reconstructing events that occurred under conditions far beyond normal human perception. Physical traces embedded in the ice reveal sequences of movement that cannot be fully reconciled with later recollections. Snow accumulation, wind erosion, and glacial movement alter the surface of Everest over time, but at high altitude these processes occur slowly enough that traces of human passage can persist in partial form. Footprints, rope lines, and compressed snowpaths can indicate direction and activity, even when a full narrative context is absent. When compared with survivor testimony, these traces sometimes confirm certain elements while leaving others unresolved, creating an incomplete but persistent record. Abandoned oxygen systems remain frozen in place at intervals along the route, indicating where climbers paused or could not continue further. Oxygen equipment is essential for survival above certain altitudes, and its abandonment typically reflects either exhaustion, emergency circumstances, or the inability to carry additional weight. On Everest, these systems are frequently found along fixed routes used during ascent and descent, marking points where climbers stopped functioning within expected progression. Their presence provides measurable indicators of altitude stress and breakdown in sustained movement. Climbing ropes fixed into the rock and ice preserve the structure of ascent, even where human presence has long since ended. These ropes are installed to assist climbers through steep or exposed sections and are often left in place for entire climbing seasons. Over time, they become partially buried or encased in ice, forming stable but silent infrastructure across the mountain. During the 1996 disaster, such fixed lines played a critical role in both ascent and attempted descent, and their remnants remain as structural evidence of the route taken. Frozen tents at lower camps retain outlines of occupation that ended abruptly when the storm intensified across the mountain. These structures, designed for temporary shelter in extreme conditions, can become immobilized by snow accumulation and freezing temperatures, preserving their shape long after human activity has ceased. Inside or around them, traces of habitation such as sleeping equipment, food supplies, or personal items may remain partially intact. They serve as markers of sudden interruption, where normal expedition activity transitioned into emergency response or abandonment. Unretrieved personal items continue to surface over time as shifting ice reveals new fragments of the expedition season. As snow and ice layers move slowly across the mountain's surface, previously buried objects may become exposed, sometimes years after the original event. These items range from small personal belongings to fragments of technical equipment, each reflecting a moment of presence that was not recovered during the expedition itself. Their reappearance reinforces the sense that the mountain does not fully release what is placed upon it. Documented positions recorded by expedition teams align only partially with the locations where physical remnants are still visible. Expedition logs, summit records, and descent notes provide structured accounts of where climbers were believed to be at specific times. However, when compared with physical evidence on the mountain, these records do not always correspond precisely with object placement or environmental traces. This partial alignment reflects the limitations of recording under extreme conditions rather than deliberate inaccuracy. Environmental conditions at high altitudes slow decay to such an extent that even minor disturbances can remain unchanged for decades. Low oxygen levels, extreme cold, and limited biological activity significantly reduce decomposition rates compared to lower elevations. As a result, materials and physical traces can persist in recognizable form far longer than in most terrestrial environments. This preservation effect contributes to the enduring visibility of the 1996 expedition's remnants across Everest's upper regions. Contradictions between recorded timelines and physical evidence suggest that parts of the descent unfolded differently than later accounts describe. While survivor testimony and expedition logs provide structured narratives, the spatial distribution of physical traces sometimes introduces uncertainty into these reconstructions. These contradictions do not point to a single corrected version of events, but rather to multiple overlapping perspectives shaped by different forms of evidence. The result is a layered understanding that resists full consolidation. No final reconstruction fully accounts for every object, body, and fragment still distributed across Everest's upper slopes. Despite extensive documentation, interviews, and analysis, certain elements remain unplaced within any complete timeline. The mountain contains remnants that exist outside fully resolved narrative structure, maintaining their position without explanation or contextual closure. This incompleteness is not unusual in high-altitude disasters, but it is particularly visible in this case due to the scale of the expedition and the conditions in which it unfolded. The mountain retains its evidence without explanation, and nothing on Mount Everest allows the story to end in a single, certain version.